This series was meant to talk about the pandemic. Not so much the bad stuff that had happened, I think we all know about that, but much more about what came out of it that was good for our community and also long-lasting. That's why this next subject we're going to talk about, I think, is so important, because it will have effects on this community for decades to come. And the food bank will have been a part of that. Back at the beginning of the pandemic, so much was happening. Jane was trying to keep things going down at the food bank. I was out in the community and tried to work with other groups who were seeking to get food supplies, or others working with donors who were wanting to help, speaking with prospective volunteers who desire to come down to the food bank or maybe even help out in the community. But also there were initiatives that were going on, things like a homeless lunch program, for instance, that had to be handled outside of the food bank. And that came together in a remarkable way, just like the greenhouse thing did. It was great. But there's a very unusual piece to this that might not be well understood, and I want to explain it because I think it's fundamental to what the food bank is all about these days. We've talked before about food security and food insecurity. Food insecurity is all about people who don't have enough for whatever reason and are having to depend on something like the food bank or other groups to be able to help to put enough food on the table for the family. Food security is about having enough, that there are enough different venues within the city and enough affordability for the products and also enough income for the people who are out there looking for food that it covers their needs. Sometimes, though, those two things come together in unique ways. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the governments all chose various groups that they wanted to help get through the pandemic. One of those was United Ways here in London. Kelly Zegner from United Way, pulled together a group of people. She cooperated with City Hall in helping to provide practical monies for programs that were out there that were obviously under huge challenges, having to almost close down or having to limit operations or to keep staff at home because not being permitted to have them come in. So it was difficult. How do you help your clients in that situation? So governments helped to give money to United Way because they were this broad umbrella group that was able to do that. Governments also gave to foundations, and that makes it a lot of sense. In London, the London Community Foundation, for instance, received some of these funds, and its job was to overall try to help to coordinate as you look into the future and what's going to happen. So here you have the United Way helping on a moment-by-moment basis, trying to help. You have the foundation trying to figure out how to move forward as we go on through the years. Nobody knew at that point how long the pandemic would last. But the third groups that government worked through, and that was all three levels of government, were food banks. A lot of reasons for that. I mean, there's over 4,000 food banks or feeding agencies across the country that are related to food banks. So that was important. Also, food banks had the ability to pull people together to communicate what it was that they were doing. And they helped millions of Canadians with food supplies. So it made sense that the governments were looking to help. A good example would be the provincial government. Kids weren't in school, but kids that when they were in school, there were some that needed breakfast or lunches to help them because they came from situations in which they weren't getting enough nutrition at home. So when they came to school, this has been developing over decades, but schools had responded, and school boards had, in ways of providing breakfast or lunches for kids that required that kind of nutrition. But then the pandemic came, and the government still had a slot in its budget about helping kids that were like that. Well, just because the kids were at home didn't mean that they still didn't require nutrition. So what the provincial government did is that it hired a firm who came together and put together lunches, school lunches for kids that were not in school. And what they did with those lunches, they were very well prepared. We got something like 300 or 400 skids of those lunches. That's a lot of food. It probably was even more than that. But in the first year, it was 300 skids. And it came to the food bank, and what was meant to happen was, although those kids weren't going to school, they were probably still in families that were at risk and therefore the food banks would be able to help them. So therefore the provincial government steered or diverted that money away from the schools through food banks to still help those same kids. That gives you an idea of some of the ingenuity that was going on, and we credit the provincial government with doing that. It made a huge difference to food banks in this province. But there's one important one I think we need to talk about, and I think it might help you to understand our mindset as a food bank. We'd already been determining that there really was no way which you could continue going on with this donation model for food banks, whether it's of money for food or food directly, and keep up with all the demand that was going on. It wasn't just about the pandemic. Food bank numbers had been mushrooming in the years before the pandemic. So it became pretty clear to us that we needed to find alternatives, ways in which food security could be established that could provide for the future. One of those ways that we have talked about is the Farm in the Box program, where we'll be working with the London District Construction Workers Association and some other community partners to put out containers that will grow this food 24/7 in ideal kind of conditions and allow us to be able to not so much depend just on the donation model, but to be able to supplement that to some degree with food that is being grown right here in London, Ontario. So that's an example of what we're talking about. But during the pandemic, as governments began to divert resources our way, it was happening at the same time that the business community was sending money our way, and where the public itself had donated food or money to the degree that it never had before. And it was amazing how much in the way of resources came into food banks across the country at that time, and including the London Food Bank. The difference with London's is that London has, at that time, 8 staff, I think. Other food banks our size might have had 20 or 25. We only had 8. But it was because we had so many volunteers. We've talked about this before in another segment. You know, we have a database of 3,000 volunteers. Half of those came in during the time of the pandemic. So this is really important. Suddenly we're getting this money from governments, and we didn't really require it because we didn't have huge amounts of staff. The public and the business community were giving to such a degree that we felt that we did not need or require that money. Now that's traditional, that's historic for the London Food Bank. We don't take government money. Our community is so generous that we've been able to handle it without that. So I remember that by the time you added it all up, the governments had offered us $1 million as a food bank to help us get through the crisis. But this was at the same time as other groups like faith groups, businesses, community associations, all sorts of groups were donating to the degree that they never had before. So we had enough. We didn't require that $1 million. So it was left to me to contact the particular individuals in those governments to say that we did not want their money, that we would send it back, and could they please put it into other areas where they might feel it was really required. Because we as a food bank had such strong community support, we were okay. And we agreed as a board on that, by the way. We sat down and talked about this money that was coming in from governments. It traditionally hadn't been our thing. We didn't have a high staff level. We had lots of volunteers and we had lots of donations. So the board agreed, let's send it back. So I contacted the governments again and said, look, we don't want the money. We're sending it back. At one point, a very high government official who you would know immediately gave me a call and said, Glenn, what are you doing? Like, our job as a government is to distribute resources to communities as they are required. So we can't be seen as a government to kind of bypass London. We have to donate that money to London. And what you do with it, of course, is going to be up to you as far as providing food. But you can't deny us as a government the responsibility of providing for the good people of London, Ontario. I was a bit embarrassed because he was right. He was totally right. The problem was we didn't require it. So what I said to him was, what would you think if we put the money, if you gave it to us, and we put it towards affordable housing? This is one of the main reasons why people come to the food bank, is because they can't afford rent. So if we put your $1 million to affordable housing, would that be acceptable to you? The answer came back immediately, yes, it is. They understand that that was really more about solutions than the in the moment thing, but they appreciated we were looking that way, so they said yes. So then we had another board meeting. I talked to the board about it. And we agreed that what we would do is that there was a special project. I'd been on the board of the London Community Foundation for years, but they were helping to kind of stick handle a group of 6 different partners who had come together and decided that they wanted to build affordable housing units on the site of the old Victoria Hospital campus on South Street. Most of those buildings had been torn down. There were still a couple that were up there for heritage purposes. But they had decided that they were going to go in there, combine their efforts together, and the London Community Foundation would help them, and then they would put up all of these units. It's perhaps the largest in the country that was designed that way. Don't forget, this was at the start of the pandemic. And so the board really agreed with that. So then I went and saw Martha Powell, who at that point, she has since sadly passed, but she was the CEO of the London Community Foundation, who I've known for 40 years. And I mentioned to her that we would like to give this money towards that project. So that's how it started. And now it's taken that project a long, long time to be able to come together for all sorts of different reasons, not trying to lay blame. Some of the buildings have gone up, but some of them have not yet. And the site itself is not yet open. But it's a massive complex. And one of the things we discovered, we met with many different partners from that area. And one of the things that we discovered is one survey had been done that showed that 70% of the people in that area of South Street had gone down the road there at Adelaide Street, not too far, to the London Food Bank to be helped at some point in the last year. It might have been once, it might have been many times. So we were in an area where the much of the food bank clientele was coming from. Now what we were trying to do was invest that money into that area so that they could get affordable housing and therefore not need to come to the food bank. It all made perfect sense to us. And so we did that. So I went then to the media, and I wanted the public to know that this is what had happened. And I was expecting there would be a lot of debate around it, but we as a board had felt that it was the right thing to do. And I really appreciate that the board took that kind of leadership here. And so we went ahead and we told the media, stories went out. And other than the odd comment that you usually get from people like that, people were overall quiet or really positive in the fact that you're looking to the future. You're not just looking to this stuff right now. It hasn't been an easy process. We still have that $1 million as a food bank. The reason being is we're waiting for them. It's up to them to decide how they're going to make their project work, all the different partners. It's taken time. There were environmental problems within the ground that had to be cleaned up, different negotiations with the city, different funding arrangements that took time to work out. But one of the things that we had told the folks from Project Soho, it's called, is that we wanted the money put only towards food or food-related stuff. We're not trying to help them with a whole bunch of other things. We are the food bank. People donate to us because we're trying to give food to other people. That's our mandate. So we offered them $1 million, but it had to go to projects that dealt with food. Now, there's many ways that could happen. One of the things that came up was that there was a need for an industrial kitchen in that area in which they could help families that were struggling to get by, right? And they would need food for that kitchen. We talked about things like greenhouses, even containers, that the product from the containers would come down to South Street and be able to put out into things like pop-up markets or collective kitchens, which is where a whole bunch of people come together and cook meals and then share them. Helps in the educational thing about food, but it also helps break down the cost of it so it's more affordable. So they are on the cusp now of getting that worked out. Our board chair, his name is Harold Krimmer. He's somebody who works in the investment industry, but he's also led other large organizations in town, like the YMCA, like Memorial Boys and Girls Club, like Ronald McDonald House. So he's a real heart for the nonprofit sector in the community, but especially towards vulnerable people. And then we also have Kim Lupus. Now, Kim is one of the heads of nutrition at the Middlesex London Health Unit, who we've always had somebody from there as part of our board because we felt that that was essential. This is Kim's term at it, and she's just been awesome. And so what we've said as a board to her is, you work with that group. So it's not us as a food bank per se interfering or anything. You work with that group. Once they decide what they want to do, then you help them to enact it, and then we will release the funds and help it to get going. And we're almost there. Now, you'll see some photos and designs in this video that I'll show you of this project. It's significant and it's huge. But people did not expect that a food bank would be part of that. And some people have said, well, where did you get that type of money that you could give $1 million to this and yet still be going out and doing food drives and things like that? And so we've had to tell people, look, it wasn't our money. It wasn't even our community's money. This was money that governments had collated and brought together and were trying to give to the food bank to help people, but that our community was so responsive that we didn't require it. So therefore, we decided to put it towards food security, not food insecurity, that we would begin to build a model that would be for the future. Yes, if it could help people who are in affordable housing not to have to come to the food bank, that's a good thing, of course. But if you are helping people to learn how to share the food, how to deal with fresh food, share recipes, cook together, eat together, all of those different things, if we can do that, then that's what we want to do as a food bank. There's nothing wrong with that. But it was never our $1 million. It could have been. We could have taken it and said, thank you very much, put it in our bank account, and it would have been great. But it wasn't. It came from the various governments, and I will say that the money that those various governments gave for us came from taxpayers. So we had to be responsible to that, as we have always tried to be. So I think the reason why I wanted to put that in this segment about COVID is, if it wasn't for COVID, that would never have happened. It wouldn't have. Prior to COVID, those 6 groups and the Community Foundation were working together to try to build that project. There's a lot of great people in that and organizations, but it was a lot. It was huge. And then all of a sudden COVID came and it became far more complicated. But the reality is, it's such a significant thing, maybe the biggest in the country, around affordable housing, that we as a food bank wanted to be part of that. For the same reason we would be part of other things that would help people to be able to reduce either the cost of food or help them with income so that they would be able to afford food prices the way that they are. And the food bank did that. So that was 3 years ago. And we have board meetings every month. And we sit down at the board meeting, and one of the agendas that our board chair, Harold Kramer's, to go through with us every month is, what about the $1 million? Where are we at? What's happening? And fortunately, we've been in consultation with all of these groups. Kim Lupus has really been doing her job at looking at the food options for that area. So, I mean, it's on our agenda every month. And it's almost there, and we're really excited about that. But I think what I'm the most excited about is we're starting off this fall, talking about food security is so important. We need to find ways of supplementing. There are some very traditional ways that should be done and are not. For instance, increasing ODSP, increasing Ontario work. Those things haven't had much of an increase in a decade. So yes, how can people afford the food of today? It's gone up 22%. Since the start of the pandemic. And yet people are still getting what they got 10 years ago. It's unreachable. You can't do it. Look at the cost of rents. Those have gone up. So yes, those things are very important, and the food bank speaks to those things, but we're not directly involved in them. On the other hand, with affordable housing, there is a way in which the food bank, helping that project, huge project, to become successful, would be that we would not only be working with a project that was, asking for lower prices for rent, but also help people to even stretch their money further by these food initiatives that we're going to be part of that will help them not have to pay the full price for groceries. That's where we're at. It's very exciting. But I'll tell you, if it wasn't for COVID-19, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. And what's so beautiful about this project is it will still be going 20, 30 years from now. It's amazing. It's amazing that these people all came together. COVID hit them, And they would have been forgiven for saying, okay, obviously the world has changed, we can't do it. But they didn't. They stuck it out. They came together. The Community Foundation kept working with them as well. And the food bank held on to that money. We didn't go rushing off and spending it somewhere else because we had committed it to Project Soho. And we're just about ready to deliver it. It's all going to be very exciting. It'll take place in this coming year. But the credit goes to those groups for pulling it all together. It was millions and millions of dollars they had to do. The food bank component is one small part of it, but it's a part of this ferment that the food bank wants to be involved with. Anything that can deal towards solutions. If we can do anything with that as a food bank, especially in areas related to food, we're there and we want to help. This is a very exciting project. And I really thank COVID-19 for bringing it about. It pulled all these partners together in ways that would not have been possible. And it allowed us as a food bank to move towards the future, solution-based, not just present need-based. It's pretty awesome.